Hello, everyone. We are back, and Jarl Crocker, Director of Training and Technical Assistance here at the Partnership, is going to get us introduced.
Thank you, Cashin, for getting us set up, and thanks to all of you for attending this webinar. As Cashin mentioned, this is the second webinar in our risk assessment series. Again, on the first webinar, which is recorded and archived on the Partnership's webpage, so you can access that at your convenience. Emily Stumhofer from the Nonprofit Risk Management Center walked us through everything you need to know about the process for getting set up for your risk assessment for your agency. In this webinar, we want to review the questions that folks who have gone through that online risk assessment process have. As you know, if you saw the webinar previously or have gone through that risk assessment, it is very comprehensive, and so we responded to some requests from the broader network that we help agencies figure out how to follow through on any findings that they identified when going through that process. And so with that, I want to turn it over to Emily. Again, this is a webinar to make sure that we have responded to your questions, so please feel more than free to type in questions in the chat window, which Cashin will help Emily to moderate. And as always, if you have any additional follow-up questions, you have Emily's contact email, and you can also contact Cashin and I directly at the Partnership. So thank you all again for your time, and I will turn it over to Emily right now.
Hello, good afternoon. This is Emily. Jarl just introduced me, of course, and hopefully most of you were with me on the earlier webinar a couple weeks back, where I walked through the process initially and talked about some of the major considerations to take into account when you're beginning the process. So today I'm going to follow up on that webinar with a little bit of guidance about how to follow through with the results of that risk assessment. So there are several components of that, and the presentation I have prepared here is pretty brief, so if you have any questions, please feel free to ask those throughout the webinar, and that will make this a much more thorough and better webinar for everyone involved. So my presentation consists of three primary points today. So first I'm going to talk a little briefly about the risk assessment again, just to give a brief overview of some of the pieces I talked about a little more in depth last time. Then I'm going to talk about 5 specific questions that we frequently get about risk assessments, both CAP's risk assessment tool and other risk assessments. These are just common general themes of what organizations and managers typically want to know more about after they've gone through the risk assessment process. And then finally, I hope to end with some questions from you guys and kind of more of a guided conversation about different aspects of the risk assessment tool that you may be struggling with or you may want to know more about. So first, a brief overview again of risk assessment. So I spoke about this last time, just how to define risk. Risk we define here at the center as an action or event that will either adversely or beneficially affect an organization's ability to achieve objectives. So this has a bunch of different components. If you were with me last time, you understand this probably a little more. I talked about it quite in depth. Risk management is a discipline or a tool for dealing with uncertainty that arises as a result of acknowledging and identifying risks that exist within an organization's operations or as a result of something that an organization is doing, some type of activity that they're doing. So this is especially relevant here because most of you at this point have gone through the risk assessment piece. So I circled that on this slide here, and I spoke about that more in depth in the previous webinar because that obviously is the point of the risk assessment tool online. So that assessment kind of gives you the ability to step back from your day-to-day activities and look at your organization and how it is working on a day-to-day basis and kind of determine where potential risk exposures exist. So with the risk assessment, you can move to this identify piece. here at the top, where you might identify risks or areas of exposures that you may not have realized existed prior to going through this kind of broad assessment. Then from there, you have the ability to really more deeply analyze these risks and try to figure out what are the different components of the risk, what types of things are circumstances or things that are contributing to this risk, why does it exist, and then also what might happen if this risk were to occur. Would we have some positive consequences? Would there be negative consequences? And then finally, what can we do to affect those consequences, or what can we do to address the underlying circumstances that lead to this potential risk? So that's the top half of this picture here. The bottom half is, I'm going to talk about this a little more in depth today. So this is what happens after you've kind of gone through, you found all these risks. Now what do? You have a bunch of different options. A few of them are listed here on the bottom half of the screen. And there are others, and we're going to talk about this a little more in depth in a little while. So the purpose of risk management, this is a slide that I also showed in the previous webinar, to gain perspective, help prepare for the future, and really build the confidence of your stakeholders. So this is important here because the assessment is one piece of this primary purpose. There are other aspects to it, and there are things that need to be done after the assessment is done to follow through and really create a really strong risk management program within your organization. So follow-up issues, and these are pretty sequential. These commonly come from one organization, all of them, and they're just aspects of how do we actually understand what we've discovered. So we've assessed ourselves, we've identified risks, we've analyzed those risks a little bit more in depth, but now what do? We don't have a next step plan. We know that these things exist, but we still don't really know how to deal with them. So the first thing here is really understanding your assessment. So it's really important, especially with the CAP assessment online, to read the report. The report is very thorough, and sometimes it can be up to, I think, around 100 pages at times. But it's really important to take the time to really read through that report and understand the different things that are identified there. The other really useful thing about this report is that it includes a lot of tips and insights about specific areas that you were asked questions about during the assessment. So in the report, it will give you specific guidance based on the answers you provided in the assessment tool. And some of that information isn't given as you're walking through the assessment. So the report has new information that can be really useful in your future risk management practice. So a second common question, and this may actually be the biggest thing that we hear, how do we prioritize our risks? We've identified areas of risk. Maybe we have 10 different areas of risk. They all seem, relevant, and like they might actually be a problem for our organization, but we can't deal with them all right now. So how do we really figure out which one to focus on at first? And this is obviously a very difficult question, and it takes a lot of information and discussion within your organization to figure out what's going to work for you. So you may feel like you don't know how to fix any of these problems. You've just identified a lot of problems. Now you have a list of these risk areas, but you don't know how to address them. You don't know how to take it to the next level. So it's going to be a learning process. Figuring out what risks are most important for your organization takes a lot of different analysis. So first, you really want to try to discover the different components of the risk. And as I said before, most risks have a lot of circumstances and underlying conditions that really contribute to whether or not they are likely to occur. And then they also have these consequences, which may be positive or negative. And usually there's both. There are some of each. So doing that analysis kind of gives you a more broader picture of your risks. And from there, you can think about these different factors that may help you prioritize those risks. So three that are really common and a lot of organizations really like to look at are the likelihood of the risk. So when you're thinking about what risks you really want to focus on as an organization, you want to know whether the risk is actually likely to occur. So something that may occur, has a very high likelihood of occurrence, should potentially be a bigger priority for your organization. But these three factors that I've listed here really work together. So if something is high on all these levels, then it may be your top priority or in the top range of priorities. So the second one here is the potential impact. So it could be a positive impact. Maybe your organization is looking for donors. So this risk event is you get a huge donation, a donation larger than any you've ever had before. So with that, obviously, there's a lot of positives. You'd have a lot more money. Your organization would have the ability to possibly put in place new practices or start new programs. But there are also potential downside risks to that. For example, if you receive a lot of federal funding, you may still have to work within parameters. The donor may put limits on what the money can be used for, and sometimes those parameters can be very stringent. So that's something that organizations need to be very aware of. So when you think about this, there may be a lot of facets to it. These factors may play into different aspects of each risk individually. And of course, the third is the availability and ease of the mitigation. So if the risk you've identified is something that you really want to reduce the likelihood of, it's something that if it happened, it would cause your organization a lot of difficulty. You want to make sure that you have the ability to affect change in that risk. So if it would be extremely costly to reduce the likelihood of that risk, and that risk is also not very likely to occur, then it may not be the best use of your resources to make it your top priority. So all these things together are really important factors to consider when you're determining what risks are your priority. All right, the third thing we hear about, and this is obviously the basis of risk management, is what does it mean to manage these risks? We know that the first step in risk management is assessing yourself. The second step is identifying these risks. And now we want to learn how to manage these risks. So managing risk can mean different things to different organizations. And again, it takes this very thorough analysis of the risks that you have to determine how best to manage those risks. And once you have analyzed your risk, there are several different options for how you may want to manage them. So back to this picture that I showed at the beginning, these three words along the bottom are different ways that organizations choose to manage risk. And the first is reduce. So to reduce risk is to really optimize the positive aspects of that risk and to try to reduce or get rid of, as best as possible, those negative consequences. And then on the flip side, you could also potentially try to get rid of the underlying conditions that make that risk more likely. So here you may want to be reducing the likelihood that the risk will occur or the potential severity of the event if it does occur. So it kind of comes on both sides of the risk before it happens, and also potentially if it does happen, how are you going to deal with that? The second option here is transfer, which is sometimes also called sharing risk. And this is frequently done through the use of insurance. So for a lot of different areas of risk exposure, organizations look for insurance as a way to kind of transfer the onus of that risk and to deal with it in a way that is most cost effective for them. So a lot of larger organizations will rely more heavily on insurance, but a lot of smaller organizations just simply don't have the financial ability to do that. But this is one option that's very popular, using this kind of risk sharing or transfer. So the third word here is control. So this is also called retention, risk retention. And this really depends on usually your board will set up some type of risk appetite or a statement of the amount of risk that your organization is willing to keep, to retain. And if certain risks are not very likely, or perhaps their impact is just simply not very large, your organization may say, we are willing to retain this risk. It's something that insurance would cost a lot for. It's something that's probably not going to happen. And if it does happen, it's not going to be very severe. The negative consequences are not going to be very severe. So they may choose to control or retain that risk. And so we call that risk budgeting. You keep that risk within your organization. You don't try to transfer it, and you don't really reduce it. There's also another option that's not on this list here, which is just risk avoidance. So certain types of risks may just have such a negative impact or potential impact if they do occur that you just want to reduce any possibility that they'll happen. And to do that, you may have to change the programs that you're offering, depending upon what the risk is. You may just want to avoid it altogether. All right, so the fourth aspect, or the common kind of question around risk management or following up to the risk assessment, is how do we continuously monitor these risks? So once you've gone through the risk assessment, you have kind of figured out what your risks are at that particular moment in time. So that's obviously going to change over time as you offer new programs, as you hire new people, as you bring on more volunteers. Your risk landscape will change. So the things that are exposing your organization to higher levels of risk are going to change over time. So it's really important to have this understanding that monitoring is not a one-time thing. It needs to be continuous and ongoing throughout your organization's life. And then also along with that, you want to keep monitoring the risks you already know about, but you also want to have the ability to identify new risks as they come up in your organization. So this timeline that I've listed on this slide kind of outlines the 3 steps of risk management. So really the first step is this risk assessment tool that you guys used, and then identifying your risks and kind of having a little deeper level of understanding about these risks, analyzing them at least in a small degree. The second piece here is making a decision about how you're going to manage those risks. So that's back to the picture that I showed on the last page where you can reduce those risks, control them, or transfer them. And then finally, this is really the third step here, and it needs to be a continuous process. Monitoring the risks that you know about and identifying ones that you have that kind of come about as your organization evolves. So the fifth aspect, and this isn't necessarily sequential to the first 4, but this is also a very common question that we hear, is about responding to risk. So once a risk actually occurs, what do you do about it? How do you really build a team and put together a group of people that can deal with the consequences of that risk, whether it be negative or positive? And usually, of course, it will have some aspects of both. So one thing that organizations often choose to do in order to make this a little bit easier for them when a risk does occur, because even with the best risk management program, you really can't make the likelihood of risk occurrence 0. It's always going to have some possible chance of occurrence. So a lot of organizations choose to categorize their risk into different kind of silos. We frequently call them silos. So some of those silos might be strategic, so strategic planning type risks that are involved directly with governance of your organization, or management decisions about what programs and activities to offer in the future. Another really common area that we see is financial, so things that directly affect the amount of money your organization has or the funding you have. Audit-related risks are often included in this silo. And then sometimes organizations may categorize their risk as either internal or external. So an internal risk might also include things like finance in terms of budgeting, and also programmatic risks, so risks that are inherent in the programs that you're offering. And then external risks, on the other hand, might be your ability to get funding from the government, and emergencies, things that cause a disruption to your normal day-to-day business. So some important considerations when you're determining what kind of risk response to have. So risk response can also be called something like crisis management, or worst case scenario, contingency planning. These are all kind of the same idea. If your worst possible risk happens, what are you going to do when it happens? So it's really important to think about these things before they happen, because then you can have a plan in place, and this is a big part of risk management. Having this plan for when a risk does occur, what are you going to do about it and how are you going to handle it? So the important things that organizations often turn to are they try to think about, for this particular risk, what kinds of people will we need to have involved? Well, we need to have somebody who's knowledgeable about finance. Will we need to have someone who knows about evacuation plans? What will we need to have? What kind of expertise? Then second, a lot of organizations have a crisis management plan that is separate from the risk assessment and the risk management function, but it frequently interrelates with that function because obviously if a risk occurs, that's frequently a crisis for many organizations, especially if it's a risk with extremely negative consequences. So that's really important. Also, who will have to be notified about this risk when it occurs? Is it something that you're going to have to reach out to every person who receives services from your organization and tell them about? For example, data breach type risk exposure. So when a data breach happens, all states have some law in place that requires that notice is given within a certain period of time and by a certain means. So it's really important to be familiar with not only laws about notice type things, but also who do you really need to tell about a risk occurrence, or who's it actually going to affect in the end. And then finally, an important consideration to think about when you're planning your risk response is this reputational protection. So reputational protection obviously is a concern of most organizations. And they really want to make sure that they're protecting their reputation even through a risk exposure and a crisis management issue. So those are the top 5 risk issues and concerns that we frequently deal with at the center. And I don't see that there are a lot of questions so far, but at this point I'm going to open it up for questions and ask you to please, if you have any questions or you have any specific issues that you felt, please reach out, ask those questions, and I'll try to answer them.
Sure, and of course, a reminder to put those in the Q&A box, and if you can, please select all panelists so that they do get seen. One of the first questions that I do have already in is a bit more of a technical on how to actually get your risk assessment together, which is, considering they have multiple locations, trying to figure out how to use the tool and combine the individual sites versus maybe trying to do one report and combine them all in. What can you do if you actually are one of those agencies that's dealing with several different departments, several different sites?
Right, so that is obviously complicated when you have these different sites that probably have very different functions in the organization. They probably offer different types of programs. That can be really difficult. So usually you'll have some type of management person, I would assume, in organizations like this who kind of oversees different aspects of the programs. And since this is, I'm not sure how common this is in agencies, but I would guess that those people that are in charge of kind of overseeing, people that have more of a feel of what all the different locations are doing, are probably going to need to be involved in this. And it may be much more difficult as, obviously it's going to be much more large scale. So it could be that you may want each of your locations to actually fill out the risk assessment separately, or perhaps there are several locations that do pretty much the same types of things. If you have a few that really specialize in something, then they may want to do the risk assessment separately. But since this is really based on your organization, and I think most of you are doing it to comply with the OMB requirements, you want to try to come up with a way to get as much of the information that encapsulates what your organization is really doing, even if it is so diverse that you have 20 different locations. You really want to try to get that into one report if that's at all possible. And obviously that will be a difficult thing to do, but you really want to do the best thing you can at that point.
Great, thanks. So we have some questions also coming in about doing the risk assessment itself. Can I get a blank form, or how can I see all the questions? Just kind of come in one or two different ways. And the first part of that I can actually answer, which is there isn't like a one full blank form, and that is because it is a smart system and it does know what else to ask, basically, depending upon your answers. So a blank PDF or something like that would not actually be that helpful. In a sense, it would make a long process even longer. But there is a kind of a follow-on question that when you complete when you print a completed assessment, is it only narrative?
Yes. So when you complete the assessment, you will get a narrative form, and it will be split into the different subsections based on the modules that you did, but it is a narrative form. It doesn't just lay out the questions that you answered and what you responded to them. It gives you this information that I kind of alluded to at the beginning. It gives you a little more insights and tips about what you've actually answered and what that means to your organization. So it's meant to kind of give you some advice and feedback about the answers you provided, not just kind of spit those back out to you.
Great, thanks. So next up here, any tips you would have to help motivate board members or department heads to buy into this process?
Right. So obviously that's difficult, and it can be extremely difficult with certain personalities. It's going to be different, of course, for every organization. But really, this process in identifying risks, understanding them, having the ability to really have more of a bird's eye view of what's going on in your organization benefits the organization in the end. And if it's really done right, it can be a tool that boards frequently really like. If you present this type of information to a board in the right way, then you can get really good buy-in. So there are lots of different ways that you might try to do this. A lot of the clients that we work with at the center, they choose a few top priority risks that they present to their board. And the way they present them to their board differs based on what the organization is actually facing. But one of our really successful clients has chosen to show their board 3 to 5 risks, I think is typically what they do. And they provide those risks in such a form that they give an outline of what the risk actually is. They talk a little bit about where it exists in the organization, what departments, and then they talk a lot about what they're actually doing to manage that risk and how that's going to be good for the organization in the end. So I think just presenting the information in a clear and concise way that really shows the board that you have an understanding of what you're doing and that you have a plan for the future, it gives them peace of mind. So a lot of the risks that boards are more worried about may be different risks than executive directors are worried about, or people that are on the ground working in the programs are worried about. But showing different risks that occur in different areas is really important, giving a more rounded view of the organization that the board may not see on a day-to-day basis, and then just kind of involving them in the process. Showing them what you're doing and asking for feedback about that can be extremely helpful.
Thanks. Okay. So we may just kind of do some generalities for now, because I think that the first webinar in this series back from July, that recording and slide deck is probably going to be the best bet for that. But can you please speak a little bit more specifically about the various categories and departments that are included in the risk assessment?
Sure, absolutely. So the risk assessment tool has 10 different modules which cover different, very specific aspects of the organization. So in the first webinar, a lot of the knowledge that's really necessary to go through this risk assessment involves a lot of kind of higher level, but there's also a lot of programmatic. So it is very comprehensive, but specifically, typically there's a lot of questions or information asked about the board and how the organization is governed, who's employed, and whether you use a lot of employees or volunteers. There's a lot of specific questions about finance and how you really manage finance in your organization. And then there are also a lot of questions about what types of clients you serve and what kinds of programs you offer. So it's very broad. It really covers pretty much everything that your organization does, but it has these 10 different modules that relate very specifically to different areas and different probably departments that are in your organization.
Thanks, and like I said, that first webinar is a fantastic tool for kind of starting to think about all those different categories. All right, next up, anything that they can do to use maybe a table or a chart to show level of risk, either with this tool or any other resources that you know of.
Sure. So this is interesting. We're actually starting to work on a different tool that is kind of a risk reporting type tool that kind of shows different levels of risk. So this particular tool, the risk assessment, is meant to kind of walk you step by step through your organization, what you do, all these different aspects of the organization, and kind of help you identify those risks. So this is kind of pointing out areas where you might have risk. It's not super detailed drilling down into what exactly that level of risk may be. So that's not really something that this tool was built to show. It's more meant to point out areas where there may be potential exposures based on the answers you've provided to this assessment. So tables and charts are incorporated into this tool in specific. There are lots of tools that you can use to do this kind of thing. And sometimes, a lot of organizations use a type of like a spreadsheet or something where they think about, especially these factors that I spoke about a few slides ago, the likelihood of the occurrence, the potential impact of that occurrence, and like whether that would be positive or negative. So those could be things that organizations use to try to measure their risk, but that's not something that this tool specifically does.
Great, thanks. All right, next up here, you had mentioned an OMB citation and risk assessment. Do you have some more information on that?
So this isn't something that I know a whole lot about. From my understanding, the OMB, well, so the federal audit requirements from the federal government require certain things be done in order to receive the federal funding. Yeah, I don't know a lot more about this. Maybe, Cashin, you could speak to this more?
I'm not also as familiar with the OMB things. What I hear most people pointing to is either the organizational standards that will be going into effect later this fall, which then would not actually be an OMB, that would be incorporated into your state law and monitoring processes, or from Information Memorandum 112, I believe it is. It was actually back during the ARA days. You no longer actually have to certify that the risk assessment was done. There was like a little form with 5 or 6 questions, and then your board chair and exec had to sign off. You no longer have to go through that kind of certification process, but the information that they do say about what areas kind of to cover, that you should be doing a risk assessment, and some of this work on the control environment and that kind of thing do still apply, even though certification is no longer required. So that's where we usually kind of point back to, is that IM 112.
Great, perfect.
So I don't know if that helps or not, but we'll go with it, and please feel free to put in follow-up questions or to find us after the webinar, either one. All right. Once the narrative is produced, what do you recommend for areas that are not at all a risk or applicable to the organization? Do you delete them? Do you just keep them in the back of the report? Where do those go?
So in my view, I would keep them if they're completely inapplicable and they're just something their organization doesn't do and you don't see the organization moving into that realm anytime in the near future. Maybe you want to delete it because it's distracting from the actual bulk of the risk assessment itself. But for things that you've simply determined they're not a risk, I wouldn't delete those. If they're applicable, the scenario or the situation is applicable to your organization, I would keep that in mind just because of this continuous monitoring approach you want to take. So even if it's not, there are no risks in a certain area at the particular point in time, that doesn't mean it's an area you want to just put aside and not think about again. It's something you want to keep thinking about on a continuous basis, so I would keep those in the report.
Great, thanks. And someone else has decided to try to help us out and suggested taking a look at OMB section 200.331. So we'll have to do a little bit of homework on that as well. But thank you to those trying to help the questioners get that done. All right, so another one, how do we prove this risk? Meaning you can say that you're in compliance to make sure that you look good or that your report comes out, but you may actually not be. Is there any way to upload evidence to each of the responses to truly kind of check that off and prove it?
Right. So this tool does not have the ability to upload any documents or evidence per se, and really the reason for that is that this risk assessment is really meant to help your organization. So if you're relying on it, if you're telling an untruth on this risk assessment, who you're really hurting is your organization, because the information that's provided in this report at the end is really meant to give you specific guidance in an area. So it's not necessarily like a homework that you're turning into someone. You're doing it really for the good of the organization. So there's no ability to add this evidence, and there's not really a need for it, simply because the reason for this assessment is internal mostly.
Great. Let's see. Next up, description of each of the 10 modules and who is included. Again, I think that the July 23rd, I believe it was, recording and slides are going to be your best bet for that because we did really try to focus on the content and types of questions that you would see in each of those, as well as what resources, whether they be documents or people, that you may want to be involved. So I would encourage you to look up the webinar recording and slides from that. Let's see, we seem to be slowing down in our questions. And where do you find that prior webinar? That is, of course, the follow-on question to that. There's actually a couple of different places. It's on the partnerships website under both National Training Center and Resources. And it is also on the TNTA Resource Center at www.csbgtta.org. We have recently started trying to get our videos up onto YouTube, so if you are a subscriber to our YouTube page, you can find it there as well. So there's multiple ways to try to come back into that, and of course we will be putting up a notice to everyone that registered for today when this recording and slides are available as well. All right, so we'll see if any last-minute questions happen to trickle in, and of course, we're here for you after the fact. Reach out to me, and we'll either answer questions or pass them along to our friends at the Nonprofit Risk Management Center. There's a wealth of resources as well that are available through our affiliate page with the Nonprofit Risk Management Center. Community Action Network is, in a sense, members by default because the partnership is a member of the Nonprofit Risk Management Center. So that does get you access to a bunch of recordings, obviously the risk assessment and policy tools that we've been talking about, as well as discounts and freebies on the Nonprofit Risk Management Centers, which Emily has hopefully put up a couple of resources for you to take a look at there. So I encourage you to go through the partnerships website. That is actually the easiest way to access it because that automatically logs you into our affiliate page. Otherwise, you kind of, in a sense, have a double login. So it is easier to go through the partnerships website to go directly into our affiliate page. But with that, closing words, Emily, that you'd like to leave the group with.
No, thank you guys so much for tuning in today, and I hope this information was helpful. And as Cashin said, please feel free to reach out to me. And on this final slide here, I've put my phone number at the office and also my email. So feel free to reach out to me if you have any more questions or you need any help with the risk assessment tool, or when you're done with it, you want a little more information about how really to follow through with your risk management practice.
All right then. Well, no one usually gets sad to end a little bit early today, and of course let us know any follow-up questions, and hopefully you guys will all be starting, if you haven't already, your risk assessment process, and we hope to see any questions that you guys have soon. Have a great afternoon.